The rejection came without warning. No raised voice, no cruelty in his eyes, just 4 words delivered as casually as one dismisses a servant who has overstayed their welcome. I don't choose you. Willa stood in the middle of the great hall of Ashvale Keep, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that the knuckles had gone white beneath her thin linen gloves. Around her, the torches burned in their iron brackets, throwing orange light across stone walls thick with tapestries of wolves mid-run, their silver threads glinting. The hall smelled of pine resin and candle wax, and the faintest trace of wood smoke drifting in from the kitchens below. It was supposed to be a celebration. The autumn feast, 3 long tables draped in deep burgundy cloth, cups of warm, spiced wine sweating in the cold air that crept under every door. She had worn her best dress for this night. Pale gray wool, brushed until it was almost soft. A braided leather belt at her waist. Her long blonde hair coiled and pinned at the back of her neck by her own trembling hands that morning, because there had been no one else to help her. She had told herself it was enough, that she was enough. She was not. Caius stood before her with his broad shoulders relaxed, his amber eyes steady and entirely without apology. He was 26, the eldest son of the Ashvale pack, heir to land and title and everything that came with both. He had the kind of face that made people trust him before he had earned it. And Willa, who had grown up in the shadow of this keep as the daughter of the pack's healer, had spent 5 years believing that face when it smiled at her. You deserve to know now, he said, his voice low, as though he were doing her a kindness. Before the formal ceremony, I've chosen Morella of the Stonecrest pack. The alliance is good for everyone. Alliance, good for everyone. As though she were a ledger entry he had crossed out with ink. Willa did not cry. She would not cry. She pressed her lips together and looked past his shoulder at the stone archway, at the dark corridor beyond it, at the cold night waiting on the other side of the keep's great oak doors. She thought, I will walk out of here before I fall apart. And she did. She turned, and she walked. And she did not look back at Caius, who she suspected did not look after her either. She was 22 years old, an omega in a pack that valued strength above all else, and she had just been told, quietly and politely, that she was not worth choosing. The night outside Ashvale Keep was merciless. Autumn in the Northern Territories meant a wind that carried ice in it long before the first true frost arrived. Willa pulled her gray wool cloak tight around her shoulders and walked the path from the keep's side door down toward the lower village, where her mother's cottage sat close to the tree line. Pine needles crushed under her boots. The smell of damp earth and fallen leaves rose up around her, thick and cold. Above, the moon was 3/4 full, hanging behind a sheet of cloud like a lamp wrapped in linen. She had made it perhaps halfway down the hill when she heard her name. Willa. She stopped. The voice was not Caius's. It was deeper, quieter, and it came from the shadowed archway of the pack's outer watchtower, where a single torch guttered in the wind. She turned. Edric Ashvale was leaning against the stone with his arms crossed and his dark eyes fixed on her. He was 24, 2 years younger than his brother Caius, and where Caius wore his authority like a well-fitted garment, Edric wore his like something he had never quite agreed to put on. He was broader through the shoulders, darker in coloring, slower to speak. Most people in the pack found him difficult to read. Willa had always found him simply honest, which was, she supposed, the same thing to people who preferred to be flattered. I heard, he said. She said nothing. I'm sorry. Are you? The words came out flatter than she intended. She was not angry at Edric. She was angry at no one she could name, and everyone she could think of. It doesn't matter. It does. He pushed away from the stone and took a step toward her. In the torchlight, his jaw was set, and there was something in his expression she could not fully read. Not pity. Pity she would have recognized and resented. Something closer to anger held carefully in check. He should have told you sooner. Months sooner. He knew about the Stonecrest arrangement before the summer. The cold that moved through her then had nothing to do with the wind. Before the summer, all through those warm months when Caius had still sought her out at pack gatherings, had still pressed a cup of wine into her hand, and stood close enough that she could smell the leather of his vest, he had already known. He had let her believe. He had let her hope. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Edric looked at her for a long moment. The torch popped and spat a small cascade of sparks into the darkness between them. "Because you should know the truth of who my brother is," he said. "And because I think you are owed at least that much." Willa turned away before he could see her face change. She walked the rest of the path down to the village alone, the wind pushing at her back like a hand urging her forward, and she made herself think of nothing at all until she reached her mother's door. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning, a rider arrived at the lower village with a sealed letter bearing wax stamped with the crest of the Iron Crown, the ruling seat of all werewolf territories, governed from the fortress city of Dravenmore, 4 days' hard ride to the north. Willa's mother, Seren, took the letter from the rider's gloved hand with the careful expression she wore when she did not wish to reveal that something had surprised her. She called Willa inside. The cottage was small and warm. Its walls hung with dried herbs in bundles, yarrow and willow bark, and the sharp-smelling gray leaves her mother used for fever poultices. A clay pot sat over the hearth fire. The smell of broth filled the room, savory and thick, with something bitter underneath from the medicinal roots soaking in a bowl on the workbench. Willa sat at the rough-hewn table and watched her mother break the seal. Seren read it twice. Then she set it down and smoothed it flat with both palms, as though pressing it down could change what it said. "It is a formal summons," she said. Her voice was careful. "From the King's Council at Dravenmore." A summons for what? Her mother looked at her. In Serene's eyes there was something Willa had not seen there in years. Fear. "For a bonding consideration," Seren said quietly. "The Alpha King has opened a formal selection. His council has nominated Omega candidates from allied packs across all territories." She paused. "Your name is on the list." Willa stared at her. The Alpha King, Roman of Dravenmore. She had never seen him. No one in Ashvale had. He was spoken of the way storms were spoken of, as a force that existed somewhere beyond the horizon, and occasionally reminded you of its power. He had taken the Iron Crown at 19, after his father's death, and in the 7 years since he had unified 4 warring territories without once losing a battle. He was said to be ruthless, precise, without softness of any kind. "I don't understand," Willa said. "Why would my name—" "Your father's lineage," Seren said. Then more quietly, "Your father was of the old bloodline, Willa, healers of the Morvain line. The council values that in an Omega candidate. I had hoped—" She stopped. Started again. "I had hoped it would never come to this." Willa looked down at the letter. The ink was dark and official, and entirely indifferent to the fact that 4 days ago she had stood in a hall in her best gray dress and been told she was not worth choosing. Now she was being summoned to be considered by a king. She did not know whether to laugh or to press her face into her hands. She did neither. She reached across the table and picked up the letter, and she read it herself, every cold and formal word of it, while the fire crackled behind her, and the broth steamed and the wind moved through the pine trees just beyond the cottage wall. She had until the new moon, 12 days, and somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the exhaustion and the ache that Caius had left behind him, something else stirred. Something she did not yet have a name for. Something that felt, despite everything, faintly like defiance. The road to Dravenmore was not kind to travelers who went alone. Willa did not go alone. The Pax Council, upon receiving confirmation of her summons, arranged an escort of 2 riders. Both older men, both quiet, both seemingly indifferent to her presence beyond ensuring she arrived at the fortress city with her life intact. Their names were Bran and Oswald. Bran had a gray beard and rode a bay mare with a steady gait, Oswald said almost nothing for 4 days, which Willa found she did not mind. She had nothing she wished to say either. They rode north along the old stone road that wound through pine forest, so dense the canopy swallowed the sky. On the first day, the air smelled of resin and cold mud. On the second, frost appeared on the grass at the road's edge each morning, thin and white, melting by midday into dark, wet patches. On the third, snow began to fall, not heavily, just a dusting that settled on Willa's gray cloak and on the horses' manes, and disappeared as quickly as it arrived, as though the sky were testing the season's patience. She rode with her braid pinned over one shoulder and her hood pulled forward against the wind, and she thought about very little. She had decided, somewhere between the cottage and the first night's campfire, that thinking would not help her. She did not know what waited for her in Dravenmore. She did not know what this formal selection meant in practice, or whether the Alpha King would take one look at her and dismiss her the way Caius had, with that particular calm that was somehow worse than cruelty, because it left her nothing to push against. She thought instead about her mother's hands smoothing the letter flat, about the fear in Serene's eyes, about what it meant that her mother had said I had hoped it would never come to this, which implied she had always known it could. On the morning of the 4th day, Dravenmore appeared. It rose from the landscape the way a mountain rises, as though it had always been there and the world had simply grown up around it. The fortress city sat on a broad, elevated plain, its outer walls black stone, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Behind those walls, the rooftops of the city climbed in tiers, and at the highest point, the great keep of the Iron Crown stood against the pale gray sky, like something that had decided long ago it would not be moved. Willa slowed her horse without meaning to. Bran drew up beside her. He looked at the city, then at her. First time seeing it? Yes. He nodded, as though that explained the silence. It looks worse than it is, he offered. Then he clicked his tongue at his mare and rode forward, and Willa followed, and they passed through the outer gate where guards in black leather and iron stood with the stillness of men who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago. The city inside was loud and alive in a way that startled her. Market stalls crowded the lower streets, canvas awnings snapping in the wind. She smelled meat roasting over open coals, and beneath it the sharp iron tang of a blacksmith's forge, and beneath that something older and darker. The particular scent of a place where many wolves lived in close proximity. Power and hierarchy, and the constant low hum of dominance that she, as an Omega, felt in her bones before she understood it with her mind. They were directed to the keep's eastern wing, where the Omega candidates were being housed. A steward in dark gray livery met them at the courtyard gate and took Willa's horse without a word. Another steward led her through a corridor of cold stone, past doors of heavy oak banded in iron, up a staircase that curved so gradually she barely noticed they were climbing until she looked back and saw how far the courtyard had fallen below. Her room was small, but not unkind. A narrow bed with a wool blanket in deep brown, a wash basin of cold water with a linen cloth folded beside it. A window with thick glass, its edges frosted, looking out over the keep's inner yard where torches were already being lit against the coming dark. A candle on the table. A wooden chest for her belongings, which were few. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against her knees and breathed. You are here, she told herself. That is all you need to know right now. She met the other candidates at supper. There were 7 of them in total, gathered around a long table in a room just off the eastern corridor. A fire burned at one end, throwing warmth that barely reached the far seats. The food was plain: bread, hard cheese, a thick stew of root vegetables and lamb that smelled of thyme and black pepper. Willa was hungry enough to eat without tasting it. The other women watched her with the particular wariness of people who are not yet sure whether a newcomer is a threat or an ally. She understood. She watched them back with the same careful attention. The one who spoke first was called Dessa. She was perhaps 25, tall, with dark copper skin and close-cropped hair. and she wore the deep blue cloak of the Iron Fen pack with the ease of someone accustomed to being looked at. She sat directly across from Willa and did not pretend to be subtle about her assessment. "Ashvale pack," Dessa said, noting the stitching on Willa's satchel strap. "Northern border territory." "Yes." "Healer's line?" Willa glanced up. "My mother is the pack healer." Dessa nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "The council likes healers, old bloodline traits." She said it without malice, simply as a fact. "They'll put you near the front of the consideration order." "I don't know what the consideration order means," Willa admitted. Dessa looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her spoon and returned to her stew. "It means the king sees you sooner rather than later. Whether that's good depends entirely on what kind of man he is." She paused. "And on that, I have heard very different things from very different people." Willa waited. Dessa said nothing more. Across the table, 2 other candidates exchanged a glance. One of them, a pale-haired woman named Sorsha from a southern territory, leaned forward slightly. "He rejected the last 3 candidates," Sorsha said quietly. "Not personally. Through the council. They were sent home after the first formal meeting." She hesitated. "One of them said he didn't speak to her at all, just looked at her and walked out." The table went quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved against the stone walls with a low, steady sound like breath. Willa thought of Caius, of standing in the great hall of Ashvale Keep in her gray dress with her carefully pinned hair, hearing, "I don't choose you" delivered with perfect calm. She thought of how she had walked out before she fell apart. She could do that again, if she needed to. She had practice now. She saw him for the first time the following morning, and it was not where she expected. The formal consideration meetings were not scheduled until the 3rd day. On the first morning, the candidates were permitted to walk in the inner courtyard, a gray expanse of flagstone bordered by a colonnade of stone arches, through which the wind moved with particular purpose. Willa had risen early, unable to sleep, and gone out alone while the others still rested. She was standing near the far wall, looking up at the keep's tower against a sky the color of old pewter, when the door across the courtyard opened. He walked out the way she imagined a storm would walk, if storms had learned to move with deliberate restraint. He was tall, very tall, with a broad frame built for the kind of weight that only came from years of actual use rather than display. Dark braids pulled back from a hard-planed face, a cut along one cheekbone, fresh enough to still be faintly red. He wore a black leather vest, cross-strapped at the chest with broad belts, bracers of dark leather at both wrists, and a fur-lined mantle that sat on his shoulders the way armor sat on a soldier. As something worn so long it had ceased to feel like weight. His eyes, when they found her, and they found her immediately, with the precision of someone who catalogued every space they entered, were a pale, unsettling blue, the color of ice over deep water. Willa did not move. He stopped walking. He was perhaps 20 feet from her. In the cold morning air, his breath came in faint clouds. He looked at her with an expression that revealed nothing, which was, she was already learning, his default state. She should have lowered her eyes. Every instinct of her Omega nature pressed her to do so. The dominant pull coming off him was immense and entirely involuntary, like standing too close to a cliff edge. Not a threat exactly, but a reminder of how far one could fall. She did not lower her eyes. She did not know why. She would think about it later, and have no better answer than the fact that she was tired. And tired people sometimes forget to perform the courtesies that well-rested people manage without thought. Roman of Dravenmore, Alpha King of the Iron Crown, looked at her for a long moment across the cold stone courtyard. Then something moved in his expression. Something small and quick, gone before she could name it. He turned and walked back through the door he had come from, and it closed behind him without a sound. Willa stood in the cold for another moment, her cloak snapping in the wind, her heart doing something in her chest she did not have a name for yet. Behind her from the colonnade, Dessa's voice came low and careful. "He never comes out to the courtyard in the morning." Willa turned. Dessa stood in the arched doorway, her blue cloak wrapped tight, her dark eyes alert and calculating. "He was watching you before you noticed him," Dessa said. "I saw from the window." Willa said nothing. She looked back at the closed door. The question that settled in her then was not why did he look at me? It was something older and stranger than that. Something that had been sitting at the back of her mind since she had read that summons letter at her mother's table. What is it that this man is actually looking for? And underneath that, quieter still, why does it feel as though whatever it is, I might already understand it? The formal consideration meeting was held in the King's Council chamber on the third day, as promised. Willa was called second. She waited in the stone corridor outside the chamber door, while the first candidate, Sorsha, the pale-haired woman from the south, went in ahead of her. The corridor was cold and smelled of tallow candles and old stone, the kind of smell that accumulated over centuries and could no longer be aired out. Iron sconces lined the walls at intervals, their flames perfectly still in the absence of any draft. Willa stood with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes on the floor, and tried to think of nothing. She had dressed carefully that morning. Her gray cloak over the cream linen dress she had brought from home, the one with the small brown stitching at the collar that her mother had done years ago. Her braid was fresh, drawn over her left shoulder, the end tied with a strip of leather. She had no jewels to speak of and no powder for her cheeks. She looked exactly like what she was. An Omega from a border pack with good bone structure and a healer's bloodline and no particular claim to anyone's attention. Dessa had looked at her before breakfast and said simply, "Good. Don't change anything." Willa had not been sure whether that was encouragement or instruction. With Dessa, it was often difficult to tell. The chamber door opened. Sorsha came out with her chin level and her face carefully composed, which told Willa nothing except that Sorsha had also learned the particular discipline of not falling apart in corridors. A council steward held the door and looked at Willa with the blank patience of a man who had done this many times. "The Alpha King will see you now." The council chamber was larger than she expected, and considerably emptier. She had imagined a full room, advisors ranked along the walls, witnesses, the formal weight of many eyes. Instead, there were only three. A gray-bearded council elder seated at the far end of the long table with a ledger open before him, a younger man in the dark tunic of a senior advisor standing to one side with his arms crossed, and at the head of the table, standing rather than seated, Roman. He was looking at the tall window when she entered. The glass was thick and old, and the pale morning light came through it in a way that flattened everything it touched. He turned when the door closed behind her. Willa walked to the indicated position before the table, stopped, and waited. The council elder spoke first. He introduced himself as Elder Croft, recited her lineage from the ledger in a dry, practiced voice. Her name, her pack, her mother's line, her father's more vain bloodline, and asked her 3 formal questions about her training in healing arts, her understanding of pack law, and her willingness to relocate permanently to Dravenmoor if selected. She answered each one in the same level tone. Yes. 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 Then Elder Croft made a small notation in his ledger, and folded his hands and went silent. Roman had not yet spoken. He was watching her from the head of the table with those pale blue eyes, and the quality of his attention was unlike anything she had encountered before. It was not the way Caius had looked at her. That warm, careless regard that she now understood had been largely performance. This was something else entirely. It was the attention of someone genuinely trying to solve a problem, thorough and unsentimental, moving across her face and posture and hands, with the same methodical interest one might give a map of unfamiliar territory. She held still under it. She did not look away. After a long moment, he said, "You're from Ashvale." "Yes. That's Caius Ashvale's pack." Something moved through her at the name. a small involuntary tightening in her jaw that she controlled immediately. His father's pack, she said. Caius is heir, not Alpha. Roman's eyes moved to her jaw, then back to her eyes. He had caught it. The tightening. She knew he had. Were you close to the Ashvale heir? He asked. His voice was entirely neutral. Willa looked at him directly. No, she said. Not in any way that matters now. The silence that followed was brief, but not empty. Roman looked at her for another moment, then turned to Elder Croft. That's enough for today, he said. Elder Croft blinked. My lord, the formal assessment requires... I said that's enough. The elder closed his ledger. The advisor uncrossed his arms and crossed them again in the opposite direction, which seemed to be the closest he came to expressing an opinion. Willa waited to be dismissed. Roman looked at her one more time. You may go, he said. And then, just as she turned, what is your name? Not your lineage. Your name. She turned back. Willa, she said. He said nothing further, but he did not look away until she had walked to the door and the steward had opened it for her. That evening, something happened that no one had anticipated. Willa was in the small room off the eastern corridor that served as a common space for the candidates, sitting near the fire with a cup of warm water steeped with dried mint. She had brought a small pouch of herbs from her mother's stores. Habit more than planning. When the door opened and the senior advisor from the council chamber walked in. His name, she learned quickly, was Aldrich. He was perhaps 30, lean and sharp-featured with close-cut dark hair and the particular energy of a man who was always slightly ahead of every conversation he entered. He looked around the room, found Willa near the fire, and came directly to her. The king has made his selection, Aldrich said, without preamble. The other candidates in the room went very still. Willa set down her cup. So soon? He has cancelled the remaining consideration meetings. Aldrich's voice was flat, professional. He has named his choice to the council. He paused for a fraction of a second. It's you. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside the window, wind moved through the courtyard. Willa was aware of Dessa across the room, absolutely motionless, watching with those dark, calculating eyes. That isn't possible, Willa said, calmly. He spoke to me for less than 10 minutes. The formal assessment wasn't completed. The king doesn't require the assessment to be completed, Aldrich said. He requires only his own certainty, and he is certain. He reached into the breast of his dark tunic and produced a folded letter, sealed with dark wax stamped with the iron crown. He placed it on the arm of her chair. This is his formal offer. You have until morning to give your answer. He left as efficiently as he had arrived. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Dessa said from across the fire, Well, she tilted her head. What are you going to do? Willa looked at the sealed letter. She thought of her mother's hand smoothing flat a different letter on a different table. She thought of Caius, and of 4 words delivered without apology. She thought of standing in the cold courtyard, with the wind in her cloak, and not lowering her eyes when she should have, and of the thing that had moved across Roman's face before he had turned and walked away. She picked up the letter. She accepted. The bonding ceremony was not elaborate. Roman, she would learn, had no patience for elaboration in any form. It was conducted 8 days later in the keep's inner hall. Stone walls, iron torches, the elder who handled the formal binding of the cord, 2 witnesses. Willa wore a dress of deep gray wool that the keep's seamstress had altered to fit her in 3 days flat, her braid wound and pinned, a thin circlet of hammered iron on her brow that she had been told was traditional. Roman stood beside her in black leather and dark fur, his hands at his sides, his face its usual composed distance. He spoke the required words in a voice that did not waver. She spoke hers in the same tone. When the cord was tied around their joined wrists, rough hemp, scratchy against her skin, smelling faintly of cedar. He looked down at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. Something passed through his eyes that she could not read. Not warmth, not coldness either. Something provisional, like a door left slightly ajar. She looked back at him and thought, I do not know you, and you do not know me. But here we are. Aldrich stood to one side with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Elder Croft recorded the binding in the official ledger, and that was that. What no one in Dravenmore knew, what Willa did not know until a rider arrived from Ashfield 3 days after the ceremony, was that her acceptance of the king's offer had reached her former pack the same hour that Caius Ashvale received a different piece of news. The Stonecrest alliance had collapsed. Morella's family had withdrawn the offer, citing a dispute over territory boundaries that was almost certainly a pretense. Caius, who had dismissed Willa from his future with 4 quiet words, and then watched his carefully arranged replacement fall apart within the same season, had reportedly gone very still when he was told. Then he had asked, according to the writer, one question. Where is Willa now? And been told, she is the Queen of Dravenmore. She was bonded to the Alpha King 9 days ago. The rider who brought this news to the keep was one of Ashvale's younger scouts, barely 18, who delivered his report to Aldrich in the front courtyard with wide eyes and the expression of someone who had ridden very hard and was not entirely sure why he had been sent. Aldrich dismissed him, walked to his own chambers, and stood at his window for a long time, looking out at the gray sky. He had served Roman for 6 years. He knew what the king looked like when something mattered to him, and when it did not. He knew the way Roman moved through a room when he was simply passing through, versus the way Roman had stood at that council chamber window on the morning of the first courtyard sighting, and not moved for 11 minutes, watching a woman in a gray cloak look up at the tower as though she were trying to understand something. Aldrich was not a sentimental man, but he was a precise one. And he wrote down what the writer had told him in the small personal log he kept in the locked drawer of his desk, not the official record, the personal one, and underlined the name Caius Ashvale twice. Because in Aldrich's experience, men who asked, "Where is she now?" with that particular stillness did not ask it only once. 3 weeks into her life at Dravenmore, Willa understood 3 things about her husband. The first, he rose before dawn every morning without exception, and by the time the keep's other occupants began moving through its corridors, he had already been to the training yard, reviewed the morning dispatches, and was seated at the great oak desk in his study, with a cup of black tea gone cold at his elbow, because he consistently forgot to drink it. The second, he did not speak unless he had something to say. This was not rudeness. She had lived long enough among men who talked to fill silence and understood the difference between that and a man who had simply decided that silence was not a problem requiring a solution. The third, he watched her. Not the way Caius had watched her. That warm, acquisitive regard she now recognized as performance. Roman watched her the way he watched everything in his keep, with attention that was both thorough and, she suspected, entirely involuntary. As though her movements through his space were information he was collecting without having decided yet what to do with it. She did not know what to make of him. She had not expected warmth. No one had described him with that word, but she had perhaps expected indifference, which would have been manageable. Indifference she knew how to live alongside. This careful, steady attention was something else, and she had not yet found the right name for it. She moved through her days with the quiet discipline she had learned in her mother's cottage. She learned the keep's layout methodically, one corridor at a time. She met the household staff, the cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Helva, who smelled permanently of wood smoke and dried rosemary, the head steward, an older man called Peter, who walked with a slight limp, and had clearly decided to reserve judgment on Willa indefinitely, the keep's young runner, a boy of perhaps 12, who was called simply Tam, and who stared at her with enormous eyes every time she passed. She found the small room adjacent to the eastern stores that smelled of old herbs, and recognized it immediately as a former healer's workroom, unused for what looked like years. She asked Peter carefully if she might use it. Peter looked at her for a long moment. "I will ask the king," he said. "Please do," she said, and went back to her room. The following morning, the room had been unlocked and a new candle placed on the workbench. She was in the herb room on the morning that Dessa arrived. She had not expected Dessa. She had said farewell to the other candidates the morning after the bonding ceremony. Sorsha had gone south again, the others scattered to their various packs, and had not expected to see any of them again. But Dessa appeared in the doorway of the workroom on a gray Thursday morning, with snowflakes melting in her close-cropped hair, and a leather satchel over her shoulder, and the expression of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. "I'm the new correspondence secretary," Dessa said. "Aldrich hired me." Willa looked up from the dried yarrow she was sorting. "Did he?" He said the keep needed someone with cross-territory knowledge and a head for pack politics. Dessa came into the room uninvited and sat on the low stool near the window, pulling off her snow-damp gloves. "I suspect he also thought you might need someone who already knows how this city works. And do you? Know how it works? Better than most." Dessa looked around the workroom with quick, assessing eyes. "You're setting up a proper healer's space." "I'm trying." "Good." Dessa set her gloves on her knee. "Because this keep has been without a healer since Roman dismissed the last one 3 years ago, and the pack's lower ranks have been treating injuries with pine tar and prayer, which is as effective as it sounds." Willa almost smiled. Why did he dismiss the last one? Dessa's expression shifted, became fractionally more careful. "That," she said, "is a longer story, and one I think you should hear from someone who was actually here." She paused. "Ask Aldrich. He'll tell you if you ask directly. He doesn't respond to anything less than direct." Willa filed that away and asked nothing more. She returned to the yarrow. Dessa sat at the window and watched the snow collect on the courtyard stones below, and between them a silence settled that was, Willa realized, surprisingly comfortable. She had not had a friend in some time. She was not sure that was what this was, but it was something, and she did not examine it too closely for fear of frightening it off. She asked Aldrich directly that same afternoon. She found him in the corridor outside the records room, carrying a stack of bound ledgers with the focused expression of a man who was mentally somewhere else. He stopped when she stepped into his path, looked at her, and set the ledgers on the nearest windowsill, with the sigh of someone who had learned to expect interruption. "The previous healer," she said. "Why did Roman dismiss him?" Aldrich looked at her. Then he said, "Because he was reporting private medical information to Caius Ashvile." The name landed in the corridor between them like a stone dropped in still water. Willa kept her face still. Why would Caius want private medical information about this keep? "Because Caius," Aldrich said, with the measured precision of a man choosing each word deliberately, "has spent the last 2 years attempting to establish leverage over the Iron Crown through whatever channels present themselves. The healer was paid. He passed along information about injuries sustained in border skirmishes, about the king's own health, about pack members who might be sympathetic to outside influence." He paused. Roman discovered it. He dismissed the healer. He did not punish anyone else because he lacked sufficient proof of a wider network. But he has not trusted a healer in this keep since. Willa absorbed this. Outside the window, snow was falling more heavily now, the courtyard below turning from gray stone to muted white. "And yet he gave me the workroom," she said. "Yes," Aldrich said. He picked up his ledgers. "He did." He began to walk, then paused without turning. "He doesn't do things without reason, Willa, even when the reason isn't immediately visible." He continued down the corridor and turned the corner and was gone. She stood at the window and watched the snow fall and thought about Caius in a way she had been carefully not doing since she had left Ashvale. She thought about him as Aldrich had described him, calculating, reaching, using people as instruments. She thought about the healer who had been paid to report. She thought about herself, An Omega from Caius's own pack, now bonded to his greatest rival. And she thought, was I part of a calculation? The question made her cold in a way the snow through the glass could not. She asked Roman that evening. She found him in his study, which she had learned to navigate by learning first that knocking was expected, and second that entering without speaking was acceptable once he had said, "Come in," because he often did not look up from his work immediately and did not mean it as dismissal. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She entered and waited. He looked up after a moment. He registered her expression and set down the dispatch he had been reading. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across the desk, the one she had come to think of as hers, though no one had said so, and looked at him directly. "Did you choose me because of Caius?" The fireplace behind him put warm amber light across his face and left the rest of the room in shadow. He was still for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and regarded her with that level, ice-blue gaze. "No," he said. "But you knew I was from his pack." "Yes, and you knew his alliance with Stonecrest had collapsed." A pause. "I knew before it was public. So I ask again." Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "Did you choose me because it would wound him? Because it would be a political statement? Because having a woman from his pack bonded to the Iron Crown would—" "Willa." His voice was quiet, not sharp, but it stopped her. He looked at her from across the desk in the firelight with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the controlled neutral she had grown accustomed to, not the calculating attention. Something more unguarded than that, and clearly unwelcome to him. "I chose you because of the courtyard." She waited. "You didn't lower your eyes," he said. Not as a compliment. As a simple statement of fact, reported with the same precision he applied to everything. Every candidate lowers their eyes when they feel dominance pressure. It's instinct. Omegas especially. He paused. "You looked at me as though you were measuring whether I was worth your attention." The fire crackled. Willa felt something move through her that she could not precisely name. "And were you?" she asked. "Worth it?" Something shifted in his expression. That small, quick thing she had seen in the courtyard, gone almost before it arrived. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had built a kingdom through precision and the absence of softness, who had cold tea forgotten at his elbow every morning, who had given her a workroom without being asked twice, and dismissed a healer who betrayed him without punishing anyone else for lack of proof. "Neither do I," she said. And then, because honesty seemed to be the only currency that worked between them, "But I'm here, and I am not anyone's instrument. Not Caius's, not yours, not the council's. I need you to understand that." Roman looked at her for a long moment. "I understand it," he said. And the way he said it, not as appeasement, not as concession, but as simple acknowledgement of a fact he found entirely acceptable, was the most surprising thing he had yet said to her. She nodded. She stood. She went back to her room through the cold, dark corridor, and she lay on her bed and stared at the low stone ceiling and felt the shape of the life she was building here, unfamiliar and uncertain, and nothing she had planned for. But hers, entirely and undeniably, hers. The letter from Caius arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days later. It was addressed to her, not to Roman, not to the council. To Willa, in Caius's own hand. She recognized the angular script from the notes he had passed her years ago at pack gatherings, back when she had believed those notes meant something. She did not open it. She carried it directly to Aldrich's office and set it on his desk and said, "This came through the outer gate courier. I want it recorded that I received it and did not read it, and I want it given to Roman." Aldrich looked at the letter, then at her. Something moved in his sharp face, not quite surprise, but its near neighbor. "You're certain?" he asked. "Completely," she said, and walked out. She did not know what the letter contained. She did not want to know. Whatever Caius had written, apology, explanation, plea, manipulation. It was a door she had no interest in opening. She had chosen this life, this cold northern keep, this precise and difficult man who forgot his tea and gave her rooms, and looked at her as though she were a problem worth solving. She had chosen it with clear eyes, and she would not look back. What she did not know, what none of them yet knew, was that the letter was not an apology. It was not a plea. It was the first move in something considerably more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. And in a tavern at the edge of Dravenmoor's lower city, on that same Tuesday evening, a man with no pack markings and cold eyes sat across a small fire from a contact he had ridden 4 days to meet, and spoke Willa's name in a very specific context. In the keep, Roman read the opened letter that Aldrich brought him, and went very still. Then he stood, and walked to the corridor, and said to the nearest guard in a voice that carried no particular urgency, but somehow arrived with the weight of something absolute. "No one leaves or enters the outer gate without my personal knowledge. Starting now." The guard went. Roman stood in the corridor for a moment alone, the letter in his hand, the fire in his study casting his shadow long across the cold stone floor. And for the first time in a very long time, something that was not strategy moved across his face, something that lived in the space between anger and fear. He folded the letter, put it in the breast of his vest, against his chest, and went to find his wife. He found her in the herb room. She was grinding dried root with a stone pestle, her braid fallen forward over one shoulder, her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. The small room smelled of pine oil and something sharp and medicinal, and a single candle burned on the workbench beside her, throwing warm light across her hands and the worn wood of the bench's surface. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and something in his expression made her set the pestle down immediately. "What happened?" she asked. He came in and closed the door behind him. The room was barely large enough for both of them. She was aware of how much space he occupied, not aggressively, but simply as a fact of his presence. He reached into his vest and placed the unfolded letter on the workbench between them. She looked at it, then at him. "I told Aldrich I didn't want to know what it said. I know. But you need to know this." He waited while she read it. It did not take long. The letter was not lengthy. Caius's angular hand covered perhaps half a page, and what it contained was not an apology or a plea, as she had imagined. It was a warning, and she understood within 3 lines that it was a warning designed to sound like concern, which was the most dangerous kind. "Willa, I write out of care for your safety. There are those in Dravenmoor's inner circle who are not what they appear. Aldrich, the king's own advisor, has been in contact with border agents who do not serve the Iron Crown's interests. I have evidence. Come to the southern gate at the new moon, and I will show you everything. Come alone. Tell no one. I am trying to protect you." She read it twice. Then she set it down. "He wants me at the southern gate," she said. "Alone. At the new moon." "Yes." "Which is 4 days from now." "Yes." She looked up at him. His face was that careful, composed distance, but beneath it something was moving. That thing she had glimpsed twice now, the thing that lived behind his precision and had no easy name. "You think it's a trap." "I know it's a trap," he said. "The claim about Aldrich is false. I know where Aldrich's loyalties are, and I have known for 6 years. But the trap is not the only concern." He paused. "The concern is that he knows your name and this address, and that he has contacts inside the lower city, which means he has been building something here for longer than I knew." Willa pressed her palms flat on the workbench, breathed. "What does he want?" "Leverage," Roman said. Specifically, leverage over me. Having my bonded mate in his possession would be considerable leverage. He said it without apparent emotion, the way he said most things. But his eyes did not leave her face. I will not allow that to happen. I wasn't planning to go to the southern gate alone at midnight, she said, with a dryness that surprised both of them. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent. Good, he said. And then, more quietly, are you frightened? The question caught her off guard. In 3 weeks, she had not heard him ask anyone how they felt about anything. She considered lying, decided against it. Yes, she said. A little. More angry than frightened, I think. He's been planning this since before I left Asheville. She paused. Maybe since before the Stonecrest Alliance collapsed. Maybe he caused it to collapse. Roman looked at her. That is exactly what I believe happened, he said. He arranged for Morella's family to withdraw so that he would be free to pursue a different strategy. And when the council summons went out and your name appeared on the candidate list, he stopped. He saw an opportunity, she finished. Yes, a woman he had already dismissed, now positioned close to his greatest rival. He believed he could use you. He believed... Roman stopped again. This time the pause was different. Longer. He believed you would still be susceptible to him. The fire in the corridor outside the closed door moved in a draft, and the candle on the workbench flickered. Willa looked at the letter lying between them on the worn wood and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but its structural equivalent. A weight finding its proper place. He was wrong, she said. Yes, Roman said. He was. They moved on Caius's network with the precision that characterized everything Roman undertook. Aldrich once told the full contents of the letter, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly at the false accusation within it, the only sign he gave of what he thought. Spent 2 days quietly identifying the contacts in the lower city. There were 3 of them. A trader at the market, who dealt in information alongside dried goods, a guard at the outer western gate, who had been accepting small payments for months, and the man with no pack markings who had sat by the tavern fire on Tuesday evening. All 3 were taken in the early hours of the 3rd morning, quietly, without incident. Dessa, whose cross-territory knowledge turned out to be precisely as useful as Aldrich had suggested, spent those same 2 days producing a detailed account of Caius's movements over the prior 6 months. Contacts he had made, alliances he had tested, the careful construction of a network designed to destabilize the Iron Crown, not through open confrontation, but through pressure on its edges. She set the finished document on Aldrich's desk without ceremony and said, He's been building this since the spring. He never intended the Stonecrest Alliance to be permanent. It was a delay tactic. Aldrich read it and underlined 17 things. On the evening of the 3rd day, Roman sent a formal dispatch to the Asheville Pax Council, not to Caius, but to the council, informing them that evidence of interference with the Iron Crown's internal operations had been documented and verified, and that Caius Asheville was to present himself at Dravenmore within 30 days to answer for it before a formal hearing. The dispatch was sealed with the Iron Crown and carried by 6 riders, which was not strictly necessary for a letter, but was the kind of detail that communicated exactly what it was intended to communicate. Willa learned of this afterward, not before, which she understood was partly consideration and partly Roman's habit of completing things before discussing them. She found him in the study that evening. He was at his desk, the tea at his elbow cold again, the fire burning low. He looked up when she came in. "The Western Gate Guard," she said. "What will happen to him?" "He will be released from service and exiled from the city's walls," Roman said. "He has a family in the lower village. He will not be separated from them for being a weak man who accepted money." He paused. "He is not the architect. He is only someone the architect used." Willa looked at him. "The healer you dismissed 3 years ago," she said. "Did you exile him?" "No. I sent him back to his home territory with his wages and a letter of dismissal. He had a daughter who was ill that winter. I paid for the healer who treated her." He said it without looking up from his desk, in the tone of someone relaying a fact of no particular significance. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand on the frame, the cold of the corridor at her back, and the warmth of the study fire at her front. "You are," she said carefully, "a very different person from the one most people believe you to be." He looked up then. His pale eyes found hers across the room, steady and direct in the firelight. "So are you," he said. "Most Omegas who have been dismissed by an Alpha they cared for do not hand an unopened letter to their husband's advisor. They read it first. At least." She felt warmth move into her face. "I was angry." "I know." Something in his expression softened, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who did not know his face well would have caught. But she caught it. "It was the right thing to do. I want you to know I understand that it was not easy." She looked at him for a long moment. This man in his cold tea study with his maps and his dispatches and his careful, contained way of existing in the world. "Roman," she said. "Yes. Your tea is cold again." He looked at the cup, then back at her. And this time, the thing that moved across his face was not small and quick. It settled. It stayed. "Come in and close the door," he said. "It's cold in the corridor." She came in. She closed the door. She sat in her chair across the desk, and she pulled the cold cup toward her, and she wrapped her hands around it and felt the ceramic slowly warm under her palms. He watched her do it with that careful, thorough attention of his. And the silence that settled between them was not the silence of two strangers sharing a room. It was something else. Something that had been building for weeks in cold courtyards and herb rooms and firelit corridors, in honest conversations, and unopened letters, and cups of tea that someone finally remembered to warm. Caius Ashvale presented himself at Dravenmore 22 days after the dispatch was sent, 8 days before the deadline, which surprised no one who understood that arriving early is the strategy of a man who hopes to control a narrative before it sets. He rode in through the outer gate on a gray horse, with 2 attendants and no weapons visible, dressed in the formal dark green of the Ashvale line. He was handsome, as he had always been, with that broad-shouldered ease and those amber eyes that looked honest even when they weren't. He had the bearing of a man who was accustomed to being given the benefit of the doubt. He did not receive it. The hearing was conducted in the council chamber with Elder Croft presiding and Aldrich presenting the documented evidence. The payments, the contacts, the letter, the 6 months of deliberate network building. Caius attempted at various points to reframe each piece as misunderstanding or coincidence. He was precise and composed about it, and Willa, sitting to one side as was her right as the bonded mate of the presiding Alpha, watched him perform innocence and felt nothing. Not anger anymore, not grief, nothing. She understood, watching him, that he had never once thought she might refuse to open the letter. He had simply assumed that she would read it, that the name she had once cared for would be enough to make her curious, and that curiosity would be enough to make her move. He had built his strategy on what she used to be. He had not accounted for who she had become. At the end of the hearing, Roman delivered the judgment in a voice that was neither loud nor emotional, and was therefore considerably more absolute than either. Caius was stripped of his position as heir to Ashvale, the council there would appoint from within, and banned from all Iron Crown territories indefinitely. His network contacts remained in Dravenmore's custody. He was given 3 days to leave. He was escorted from the chamber by 2 of Roman's guards. At the door he stopped. He looked across the room, past Aldrich, past Elder Croft, directly at Willa. She met his eyes. She did not look away. She did not speak. He left. Epilogue. Winter came to Dravenmore fully in the weeks that followed, the kind that arrived not dramatically but with the quiet permanence of something that intended to stay. Snow settled on the black stone of the outer walls, and on the rooftops of the city's tiers, and on the flagstones of the inner courtyard, where Willa had once stood in the early morning, and not lowered her eyes when she should have. The herb room was properly supplied by midwinter. Willa had sent a careful list to the market through Peter, who had stopped reserving judgment on her somewhere around the 3rd week, and had transferred instead to a gruff, practical concern that expressed itself primarily through ensuring her requests were filled quickly. Helva in the kitchen began leaving small portions of whatever she made, aside for the evenings when Willa worked late over her preparations, covered with a cloth on the workbench to stay warm. Tam, the young runner, had appointed himself unofficial carrier of messages between the herb room and the rest of the keep, a role no one had given him, and no one revoked. Dessa remained as correspondence secretary, and proved to be exactly what Aldrich had said, someone who knew how the city worked. She and Willa had a habit of meeting in the common room on Wednesday evenings, with something warm to drink, which had not been formally arranged and was never formally discussed, but happened with the reliability of something that had always been planned. Aldrich continued to be precise, a little ahead of every conversation, and absolutely loyal. He began, gradually, to include Willa in certain correspondence briefings. Not formally, just practically, because she was often in the room and her observations were consistently useful, and he was not the kind of man to waste a useful thing. And Roman. Roman still rose before dawn. His tea was still frequently cold. His face was still, to most people who encountered it, a careful and composed distance that revealed very little. But Willa knew the exact quality of his attention now. She knew the difference between the way he looked at a dispatch he was analyzing and the way he looked at her when she said something that surprised him. She knew that he had, at some point in the deep cold of that first winter, developed the habit of stopping by the herb room in the late afternoons. Not to say anything in particular, just to lean in the doorway for a few minutes with the expression of a man who has found a place where the noise inside his own head is somewhat quieter. She did not make a point of it. She simply left space for it. The way she left space for the silence between them that had long since stopped being empty. On a January evening with snow falling thick and white outside the thick-paned windows, and the fire in the study burning properly high for once, Willa sat in her chair across the desk and looked at her husband reading his dispatches in the warm light and thought about a gray dress and 4 words and a hall full of torches and the particular cold of being dismissed by someone who had never actually seen her. She thought about how strange it was, how entirely unplanned and unreasonable, that the path from that hall had led here, to this room, to this man, to this life that she had not imagined and would not now trade for anything she could name. Roman looked up and found her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Your tea is hot, actually. I checked." He looked at the cup. He picked it up and drank from it, and the expression that crossed his face was simple and unguarded, and entirely his. "Thank you," he said. She smiled, and outside, the snow fell on the black stone walls of Dravenmoor, and the city settled into its winter, and in the study of the Iron Crown's keep, the fire burned warmly against the cold, and 2 people who had found each other by the most improbable of routes sat together in a silence that needed nothing added to it. Caius Ashvile left the territories in the early spring and was not heard from again in any official record. Whatever regret he carried was his own to keep. Willa never looked back, and Roman, the Alpha King of Dravenmoor, who had been described as ruthless and cold, and without softness of any kind, remembered his tea every morning for the rest of his life.